Under fluorescent light, the Hallberg Institute of Technology's halls shone with a sterile brilliance that reflected more ambition than warmth. There, students walked quickly in groups, clutching laptops and cups of coffee, debating neural algorithms or quantum irregularities. They were too preoccupied with deadlines and data to notice the woman who kept the floors beneath their futures clean and silent. Mrs. Sato, 70 years old, 5 feet tall, always wearing a light blue janitor's uniform and white orthopedic shoes, pushed her cart with a steady rhythm of someone who no longer needed to be seen to feel present. Her silver hair pulled neatly into a low bun, eyes downcast but always observant, taking in the world without needing to interrupt it. She came in at 4 p.m. sharp, never missed a shift, and worked until the last of the night classes emptied and the corridors grew still, mopping, wiping, dusting chalk off lecture podiums, and silently gathering crumpled pages of failed dreams and forgotten theorems. Papers others discarded without a thought, but which she read with quiet reverence, remembering a time when her own fingers once danced across proof sheets in distant Tokyo lecture halls, when numbers flowed through her like wind through plum blossoms. No one asked her name anymore. Professors offered polite nods. Students barely made eye contact, and only the older security guard, Mr. Billings, a kind man with arthritis and a love for jazz, occasionally asked about her family in Japan, to which she always answered softly, "Gone now, but I have the work," and he'd nod as if understanding, though he never pressed further. One Tuesday evening in early March, as the sky outside began shifting into soft lavender dusk, and students filed out of Professor Wexler's third-floor classroom like exhausted ants. A large blackboard in the corridor had been filled with dense symbols and boxed off in red marker with a bold header. The Hallberg problem. $5,000 cash reward for a full proof. Deadline, April 15th. Below it were integrals, abstract polynomials, sequences stretching across disciplines, a fusion of number theory and topology that even doctoral candidates whispered about as a joke among themselves, knowing full well it stumped visiting scholars and postdocs alike for nearly a decade, and Mrs. Sato had been polishing the brass doorknob beside the classroom when she looked up, as if the chalk itself had whispered her name. Something in the arrangement of the variables caught her breath. The elegant curvature of summation, the misplaced assumption in the fourth line, and for a moment she stood utterly still, not as a janitor, but as the ghost of a woman who had once been called the Mind of Kisarazu, a nickname given to her in the 1980s when she'd stunned Japan's academic elite by publishing a thesis on infinite series convergence at the age of 25, a paper still buried in old journals few bothered to translate. She stepped closer, careful not to smudge anything. Her heart beating softly, not with nerves but with memory, and though her hand trembled slightly from age, her mind was sharper than it had been in years. She could already see the error in the setup, the symmetry that had been missed, the assumption of linearity that didn't hold when carried through dimensional reduction. She glanced around. No one in the corridor, then slowly pulled a fresh piece of chalk from the tray and, with the grace of someone writing poetry in a language only she could read, began sketching corrections along the right-hand edge of the board, her handwriting delicate, almost apologetic, as if she wasn't solving the problem, merely introducing to the truth it had forgotten. Line by line, she worked, no notes, no calculator, just memory and mind, occasionally stepping back to assess flow like a painter judging balance, and when she finally set the chalk down, over 30 minutes later, her sleeve dusted lightly in white. She did not sign her name, did not look for applause, simply wiped her hands on her uniform, bowed slightly to the board as if it were an old friend, and returned to her cart to finish sanitizing the restrooms. The next morning, a third-year math student named Connor Chong walked by the board on his way to advanced statistical mechanics and froze, eyes widening at the new markings. He wasn't sure who had added them, but something about the logic, the placement, the precision sent a chill down his spine. Soon 3 others gathered, then 8. Then Wexler himself arrived, and the corridor was buzzing as he adjusted his glasses and muttered, This can't be right." But the way his voice broke in a word can't betrayed the rising suspicion that maybe, just maybe, it was right, and by mid-afternoon, students who had once laughed at the Hallberg problem now huddled over phones and screenshots, trying to trace the elegant solution left without fanfare. The footage review began. Wexler demanded to know which of his grad. Students had cracked it, but when they pulled up a hallway camera, what they saw made everyone fall silent. a small elderly woman in a janitor's uniform, alone, unhurried, solving the problem like she was tying a ribbon, then walking away without a word, and someone whispered, "Who is she?" But no one had the answer yet, because until now, no one had bothered to ask the name of the woman who'd been walking their halls, cleaning their spaces, erasing their mistakes, all while holding inside her a mind that could still outthink them all. The math department buzzed like a disturbed hive, professors arguing in low tones, graduate students speculating wildly, and the dean demanding a formal review of the board footage, as if a crime had occurred rather than a miracle. And meanwhile, Mrs. Sato continued her shift as if none of it concerned her, buffing the marble floors in the engineering wing, emptying the trash in the chemistry labs, her eyes lowered not from shame, but from a lifetime of knowing that people only look up when status forces them to, and she had long since relinquished any need for validation from eyes that didn't truly see. But the truth of her story stretched far beyond the narrow corridors of Hallberg Institute, back across an ocean, back to a younger woman once, named Dr. Keiko Sato, a prodigy born in the seaside town of Kisarazu, where as a child she'd spent hours copying numbers into the margins of her school books instead of paying attention to the lessons, because she already knew the answers, not by calculation but by intuition, as if numbers spoke to her in rhythms and shapes the rest of the world hadn't yet discovered. Her father had been a watchmaker, her mother a nurse, both proud but humble, and when she received a scholarship to study theoretical mathematics at Kyoto University, it was the first time anyone from her family had gone beyond the prefecture, but she soared there, graduating with top honors, publishing her first paper before age 23, and by 30 she had secured a place among Japan's most respected academic circles, her work on nonlinear transformation functions becoming the basis for systems still taught today, though few remember the name behind the theorem. Her future was boundless, invitations from Princeton, Oxford, MIT, and yet she chose to stay in Japan to care for her ailing mother and help raise her younger niece after tragedy struck. Her brother lost to a rail accident, her sister-in-law vanishing soon after, and she gave up conferences and global lectures to anchor herself in quiet responsibility, something her colleagues never understood and her male peers never forgave. Years later, when her mother passed and the political climate shifted, Keiko found herself ousted in a quiet academic reshuffling, her position replaced by a foreign-educated male professor with fewer credentials but more social backing. And without warning, the grants disappeared, the lecture invitations stopped, and by the time she applied for reinstatement, she was told gently that her time had passed. What followed was a decade of slow descent, odd tutoring jobs, cleaning work to make ends meet, a fractured attempt to publish under pseudonyms that gained traction in the West, but were never traced back to her. And finally, with her niece grown and married in California, Keiko packed what little she had, boarded a one-way flight to the United States, and took a night shift janitorial job offered through a local temple's connection to Hallberg Institute, not because she lacked skills, but because by then she no longer cared to prove herself to anyone. She simply wanted peace, silence, and the comfort walking among numbers again, even if they weren't hers. And so the woman who once taught formulas now cleaned beneath them, listening each night as professors lectured on theories she'd quietly improved years before, brushing away chalk dust from boards that echoed with her own ghosts. And perhaps that's why, when she saw the Hallberg problem, when the symmetry of the equation leapt off the board and danced into recesses of her long slumbering genius, she didn't hesitate. Because somewhere deep inside, the girl who once scrawled proofs by candlelight had never truly left. Meanwhile, back at the Institute, Professor Wexler had convened a faculty meeting, red in the face, trying to decide what to do with the revelation that his janitor, had solved a problem no tenured scholar could touch. Some suggested it must be plagiarism. Others mumbled about mental health evaluations, but none dared confront her directly, until Dean Hartley, a quiet woman with a background in logic theory, requested a private meeting with Mrs. Sato after confirming the surveillance footage. When Mrs. Sato arrived at the dean's office, her mop cart left outside, she sat gently in the guest chair and listened as Hartley asked, "Did you solve the equation on the third-floor board?" To which Mrs. Sato answered only, "I noticed something was off." When asked about her background, she finally stated, "I was a mathematician once. I thought perhaps I could offer another approach. Long ago, in another country, But I'm only here to clean. And Hartley, swallowing her astonishment, replied softly, "That may be true, but you've just rewritten the story of this institution." And for the first time in a long time, Mrs. Sato allowed a very small, very tired smile to touch her lips. Not because she was proud, not because she had finally been recognized, but because someone finally had listened without disbelief in their eyes. Word spread quickly. Students began whispering in awe as she passed, professors now nodding with full eye contact, and graduate students who once chuckled at her slow gait now held doors open with reverence. And yet Mrs. Sato didn't change her routine, didn't request to be called doctor, didn't alter her hours. She simply continued cleaning, continued watching, her mind gently hummed with equations long buried beneath silence, as the world slowly realized that genius doesn't always wear a badge, and that brilliance, when wrapped in humility, has a way of revealing itself, not with thunder, but with grace. Be why Thursday morning, the equation on the third floor board had become more than just a challenge. It was a campus legend, a living mystery pulsing through every corridor of Hallberg Institute like a mathematical ghost story. It wasn't just a solution that stunned the students and faculty, but the style in which it had been written, elegant, deliberate, flowing as if composed by a poet rather than a technician, as though the problem hadn't been solved by brute force, but by someone who knew the answer before the question had even finished breathing. And for many, that kind of precision felt mythical, impossible, until the security footage revealed what logic had refused to guess. The hand that had drawn those elegant symbols belonged to the janitor who had silently passed them in the hallway for years. When the video was discreetly shown to the faculty council, several professors gasped audibly, and one even muttered, "No, that can't be her," as if reality had betrayed them, as if intellect were something reserved only for those who stood behind podiums or carried PhDs, not for a woman pushing a mop. The moment the footage leaked, and it always leaks, the campus erupted. Student forums overflowed with disbelief, then awe, then shame, and by lunch, half the student body had watched the clip of Mrs. Sato calmly stepping up to the board, solving the legendary problem, and walking away without a single word or glance. At the camera, and by mid-afternoon, social media caught fire with hashtags like hashtag #ChalkDoesGenius, hashtag the janitor solved it, and hashtag Professor Sato, as photos of her cleaning in the math wing were contrasted with screenshots of her finishing the final integral with an effortless grace that made it look like calligraphy. But while the internet spiraled into speculation, memes, and debates, the math department found itself staring down the barrel of an uncomfortable question. What now? Because the problem had been solved, yes, but by someone outside their chain of credentials, someone not on their rosters, someone who didn't fit the narrative of genius they were used to celebrating. Professor Wexler tried to spin the story by claiming she had simply contributed to an existing approach, but his voice cracked under the scrutiny of a dozen graduate students who had already attempted the same problem and failed. And by evening, the university had no choice but to acknowledge her officially. An internal memo was sent to all faculty. The Hallberg equation has been resolved by Ms. Keiko Sato, employed in facilities. A review of her work is underway. Please be respectful of her privacy during this time. By the following Monday, students had waited in the hallways just to catch a glimpse of her as she worked, whispering that's her with the kind of reverence usually reserved for Nobel laureates or visiting astronauts. However, she continued her duties without pause, sweeping quietly as if nothing had changed, her face calm, and her shoulders unburdened by the storm she'd set in motion. Only an Indian-American doctoral candidate named Rina Patel approached her directly that week. She had struggled Sato outside the break room, saying, "You showed me that I don't have to wait for permission to be brilliant," to which Mrs. Sato smiled and replied in her softly accented English, "Brilliance doesn't ask, it solves." And Rina, shaken by the simplicity of the answer, later wrote that moment into her doctoral thesis dedication. Soon after, the dean convened a public symposium titled Reframing Genius, the unexpected mind of Keiko Sato, inviting Mrs. Sato to speak. But she declined politely, saying she had nothing to prove, and when asked if she would like to teach, she said only, "I will help if asked, but I am not here to impress anyone. I am here to keep things clean. Ideas, floors, minds, if I can." And that statement alone was quoted by 3 national newspapers by the end of the week. Meanwhile, the mathematics behind her solution was now under peer review by 2 Ivy League committees, and already being called the Sato method, a unique reduction algorithm using simplified visual constructs that bypass much of the brute computation previously assumed necessary, and in doing so, her work opened doors to solving other hybrid problems in number theory. Previously believed intractable, invitations began arriving at the administrative office addressed to Dr. Sato from Caltech, from Oxford, from a Parisian symposium on recursive modeling. But Mrs. Sato, as always, remained grounded, continuing to fold the cleaning rags herself, occasionally humming an old Japanese lullaby as she wiped down the very boards now covered in new equations sparked by her method. But perhaps the most striking shift was among the students, those who had once passed her, without acknowledgement now nodded with quiet respect, some leaving origami cranes near a cart with notes saying, "Thank you for reminding us where genius lives," while others began meeting in late-night study groups not in lecture halls, but in the very corridor where she'd solved the problem, hoping her spirit might linger there and awaken something in them too. And though Mrs. Sato had not asked for attention, fame, or credit, she had, in the purest sense, reminded a place built on intellect what humility looked like when it wore brilliance like a second skin, and the world, once blind to her presence, was finally seeing clearly. The official announcement came not through a press conference or a viral video, but through a single-frame placard mounted quietly beside the infamous chalkboard in the mathematics wing, a simple bronze plaque that read, "This problem was solved on March 5th by Mrs. Keiko Sato, a mathematician of extraordinary insight and grace. May we never again overlook genius where we least expect it." The day it was installed, students gathered silently in front of it, some leaving small flowers beneath the frame, others simply standing in stillness, unsure how to reckon with the fact that they had passed by her for months, years even, without ever seeing her for who she truly was. Inside the faculty lounge, the tone had changed, no longer defensive or dismissive, but humbled, unsettled by how much their elite institution had missed, and perhaps ashamed of how easily they'd accepted a system that presumed intelligence could only wear certain uniforms, speak a certain way, or come with certain degrees. And yet, none of that dissonance reached Mrs. Sato, who declined every press invitation, every TED Talk, every honorary degree, responding only with handwritten notes that said things like, "Thank you, but my place is still here," or "Mathematics is not performance, it is a practice." When Dean Hartley attempted one last appeal, offering her a full-time lecturing position with pension and tenure, Mrs. Sato simply smiled and said, "I have already taught them," and gestured to the hallway where now every student passing through slowed down to read the equations on the wall, as if for the first time, truly curious, truly listening. Meanwhile, a younger faculty member, Dr. Lin, who had once struggled to gain respect in the male-dominated department, requested permission to build a new seminar titled Mathematical Intuition, the legacy of Keiko Sato, and to her surprise, the course filled in under 10 minutes, with students from computer science, physics, and even philosophy begging for a seat, not just to learn math, but to understand how a janitor could see in numbers what no one else could, and what that said about how we define intelligence in the first place. As the semester wore on, Mrs. Sato's quiet legend grew, not in scandal or spectacle, but in the daily shift of perception, in the way students now picked up litter when they saw her cart, in the way professors paused before dismissing unconventional ideas, and how a place obsessed with data had finally learned to see the immeasurable. Still, Mrs. Sato remained the same, arriving on time each evening, polishing handrails, scrubbing chalk trays, humming faintly in the stairwells, her presence no longer invisible but now strangely sacred, like a monk who had shown the path and then returned to her, sweeping. One rainy evening, as lightning cracked across the sky and most of campus had emptied, Mrs. Sato stood alone in the corridor where it had all begun, gazing at a new set of equations scribbled by a first-year student testing out a theory she'd heard in Dr. Lin's class, and with quiet amusement, she stepped forward, erased a small miscalculation, and gently corrected the angle of a symbol, not rewriting the work, just realigning its intent. And when the student returned the next morning and saw the change, she didn't feel corrected. She felt guided, as if the universe had whispered back. News of that small moment spread quickly, and students began to refer to such edits as a visit from the chalk spirit, though everyone knew it was just Mrs. Sato doing what she had always done, shaping the world without demanding it notice. The university eventually published a formal journal entry on her solution, listing her as the primary author, with a footnote that read, "Submitted on behalf of Mrs. Keiko Sato by the Department of Mathematics, with deepest respect and overdue recognition." And that journal, the Journal of Theoretical Mathematics, became the most downloaded edition in its history. Yet, for all the accolades, all the noise, what Mrs. Sato cherished most came not from the academic world, but from a letter slipped into her cleaning cart one evening, written in careful cursive by a shy sophomore named Daniel, who had struggled with math his entire life. "Dear Mrs. Sato, before I saw you solve that problem, I thought maybe I just wasn't born with a math brain. But now I think maybe math isn't just for people with the loudest voices. Thank you for making me feel like there's still time to understand things." She folded the letter and placed it inside the small compartment of her cart, right beside a faded photo of her younger self at a chalkboard in Kyoto. And for the first time in many years, she let herself sit down early, close her eyes, and breathe. Not because she was tired, but because for the first time in decades, her work had been enough, not just to solve a problem, but to reveal something far greater. That brilliance lives not in titles or applause, but in quiet persistence, waiting patiently for the world to be ready to recognize its light. IT was on a brisk autumn afternoon, nearly 7 months after she quietly solved the Hallberg equation, that the university's grand auditorium, usually reserved for Nobel laureates, international guests, and commencement ceremonies, filled not with pomp, but with stillness as students, professors, alumni, and journalists from across the country gathered not to witness a lecture, but to acknowledge a truth long overdue. And when Mrs. Keiko Sato stepped onto the stage wearing her light blue janitor uniform instead of the honorary robe they had prepared for her, the entire room rose to its feet in silent respect, not out of obligation, but because they understood the significance of her choice. She had never worn a costume to be accepted, and she would not start now. The dean stood beside her at the podium, eyes glassy, voice cracking slightly as she said, "In a world obsessed with titles, degrees, and appearances, Mrs. Sato reminded us that true knowledge has never needed permission to shine." And when the applause finally settled, the spotlight turned to Mrs. Sato, who adjusted the microphone with steady fingers, took a slow breath, and said softly, "I have never been much for speeches, but thank you for seeing what was always there." And though her voice was barely above a whisper, every corner of the auditorium heard it, because her presence had never needed volume to command attention. She spoke briefly about numbers, not as weapons of intellect, but as companions, steady and honest, unchanging when the world around them was chaotic, and how, in her youth, she once believed that solving great equations would earn her love, respect, permanence, only to learn that the world often rewarded the loudest, not the brightest, the celebrated, not the steady. But that didn't mean the work wasn't worth doing, because brilliance, like truth, does not vanish when ignored. It only waits quietly for its moment. The audience, many with tears in their eyes, listened as she shared how cleaning classrooms reminded her of solving problems, that both acts were about restoring order to chaos, about gently wiping away what was unnecessary to reveal something clean, whole, and right. And when she bowed gently and returned to her seat, refusing the velvet armchair offered her on stage in favor of sitting cross-legged on the floor, like she had done as a student long ago, the standing ovation that followed was not explosive, but reverent, long, breath-held, echoing to the arches of the great hall like a benediction. In the days that followed, Hallberg Institute renamed the mathematics corridor the Sato Wing for Quiet Genius, and painted the equation she solved in gold above the entry, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that some of the most extraordinary minds walk among us unnoticed, not because they are hiding, but because we forget to look beyond the surface. Mrs. Sato continued to work part-time, refusing a full retirement package, saying only, "I still like the quiet hours," and was seen often tutoring students in the late evenings, sometimes sitting with first years on the floor, helping them with calculus using folded napkins and broken pencils, her eyes twinkling with the same patience that once traced centuries-old equations into dust-filled air. Her name was added to international journals, cited in 3 groundbreaking studies, and inscribed onto the honorary wall beside the university's founders. Yet she never brought it up, never pointed it out, not even when passing by. because for her, the legacy was not in being remembered, but in helping others discover what they were capable of remembering within themselves. In her final year before choosing to return to Japan, she received one last letter, this time from a former professor at Kyoto University who had once dismissed her as too gentle for academia. He wrote simply, "You were always the brightest star. Forgive me for not looking up." And though she never replied, she smiled and folded the letter neatly into her suitcase beside a fresh box of chalk, a gift from the students she mentored, each piece hand-labeled with their names and a quote they'd remember from her, phrases like "saw with respect," "be kind to the unknown," and "math is just listening with patience." When she finally left Hallberg, she did so in the early morning, before sunrise, no fanfare, just a soft goodbye to the janitorial crew, a final sweep of the marble stairs, and a pause outside the Sato wing, where she touched the brass plaque once, bowed gently, and stepped out into the crisp air, carrying with her no awards, no certificates, only the deep, steady joy of having once been invisible and then by grace and truth finally seen.